Last week, one of the things that we saw was the man Mordecai and how instrumental he was in helping Esther make the right decision. It's interesting, though, that when we talk about Esther, when we think of the book of Esther, we usually think of Esther as the main character, don't we? It's named after her. And she certainly this evening is the main character in our text this evening. But it's interesting that behind the scenes, Mordecai is the most influential character. He's the one that really influenced Esther. Last week we saw Mordecai gave Esther essentially an ultimatum. Her answer, her response when Mordecai suggested that she ought to go to the king and appeal the death sentence for every Jew in the world. Her response was that, can't do it. Can't happen because the only time I can go in to the king is when he sends for me. And Mordecai's response to her was, think not. Don't think that if we're all hung and killed, that you're going to escape. Here's the deal, Esther. If you won't be the instrument of God in this matter, your father's house will cease to exist, but God will save His people. And Mordecai understood the importance of God's promise. My friend, one of the great evidences of providence, quote, as the world sees God, is the preservation of God's people, the Jews. And Mordecai very, very well understood that you can kill Jews, but you can't wipe out the nation because of God's promises, His future promises. These are messianic in Mordecai's day. And so you can't wipe out Israel because God has a future plan for them. So Esther, if you choose to let God use you for good, then you could be part of God's plan. But if you refuse to let God use you as part of His plan, God will use someone else, but you won't survive it. And wow, is Mordecai ever the influential uncle? We kind of looked at his character last time. Well, tonight I would like to begin in chapter 5, and I really would like to look at Esther's going into the king for petition. Then we're going to look at material on both sides of this. Chapter 5, verse 1. Now it came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house, over against the king's house. And the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house over against the gate of the house. And it was so, when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. Then said the king unto her, What wilt thou, Queen Esther? And what is thy request? It shall be even given thee to the half of the kingdom. And Esther answered, If it seem good unto the king, let the king and Haman come this day unto the banquet that I have prepared for him. Then the king said, Cause Haman to make haste, that he may do as Esther hath said. So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And the king said unto Esther at the banquet of wine, What is thy petition, and it shall be granted thee, and what is thy request? Even to the half of the kingdom it shall be performed. Then answered Esther and said, My petition and my request is, if I found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my petition and to perform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall prepare for them, and I will do tomorrow as the king hath said. Father, help us both with understanding, but Lord, also help us as we look at the actions of men to understand the appropriate way that we ought to behave even in times of difficulty, appeal, and adversity. We thank you for what you'll do now in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, I want to first of all, before we really look at the main point this evening, I want to look at just a little truth here this evening. And the truth that I want to focus on first is the inconsistency of bigotry. the inconsistency of bigotry. You ever met a bigot? Ever met a bigot? You could define bigot a lot of ways, but a bigoted person would be someone who has a conceited notion that they are better than someone else, or that they hold a prejudice against a particular person or a particular people group. And I just think it bears out, if you look at chapter 5 and verse 9, if you look at Haman, who was a classic bigot. Then went Haman forth that day, joyful and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood not up, nor moved for him, he was full of indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman refrained himself. When he came home, he sent and called for his friends and Zeresh his wife. And Haman told them of the glory of his riches, and the multitude of his children, and all the things wherein the king had promoted him, and how he advanced him among the princes and servants of the king. Haman said, moreover, yea, Esther the queen did let no man come in with the king unto the banquet that she hath prepared but myself. And tomorrow am I invited unto her also with the king. Of course, he goes on to say that this availeth me nothing, as long as I see Mordecai the Jew in the king's gate. His sweet wife Zeresh said, well, honey, comfort yourself. Build him a gallows so big that'll remind you while you go in to the honored banquet, it'll remind you that Mordecai is going to hang from a very high place. Haman was bigoted. This man Mordecai really had not affronted him personally, but Mordecai had not bowed to him. And because Mordecai had not bowed, Haman was not content to have vengeance on Mordecai. It is very evident here that Haman had the right to take Mordecai's life himself. Didn't need the king's approval, didn't need permission, but the slight that Haman felt by Mordecai's not bowing to him was so much that Haman wasn't content with simple revenge. Haman had to get not only Mordecai, but anyone who was connected in any way with Mordecai. And of course, we're insiders. We know the irony of it all is that he's honored to be invited as the special guest to Mordecai's niece. Literally, he hates Mordecai, hates all Mordecai's people. And Mordecai's niece is invited to a special banquet, and it's really, at this point in time, the climactic event in his life. It really is his greatest achievement, is that the queen, who's Mordecai's niece, has invited him to a special banquet. And yet the thing that vexes him the most is that Mordecai has slighted him in his mind. Well, you know the story, I think, of Esther. You know how that the king that night couldn't sleep. And as he could not sleep, or while he could not sleep, the king did what I do. He read. And he evidently didn't have Facebook to check up on in the middle of the night. So he read the Chronicles of the king, the things that happened in the palace. He said, what's been going on around here? And so he read the news, the things that had happened in recent history, and he's reading along, and all of a sudden he found an interesting article. The article was interesting to the king because it involved himself. Someone had tried to kill him, and he never heard about it. But two guys who he thought were trusted in his court had plotted to kill him, but he was still living. Because one man, Mordecai, had turned those guys in. And the king, King Ahasuerus, said, wow, this guy Mordecai is a good guy and he's helped me out and I didn't even know it. I have a loyal subject. This man has done me a great favor. And so he began to inquire. The king said, what did they do to take care of him when he saved my life? Who took care of Mordecai? And they said, well, nobody's done anything for him. Nobody's done anything? Really? We don't count. No one counts our life as precious as we ourselves do. Right? And so no one thought it was a real big deal that Mordecai spared the king's life, but the king thought it was a big deal because it was his life that was spared. No one's honored him. And, and he couldn't sleep that night. So he's thinking about this, and it's on his mind in the morning when he gets up, and the first person he saw in his court, he said, call somebody in from the court. In comes who? Well, the guy that liked to stand in the first place in the court, Haman. Haman, what would you do for a guy? I mean, if you just really want, if there was somebody that, was really special to you. Well, I know who he's talking about. Haman's in the first spot in the court. Somebody that your soul just delighted to honor. You just wanted to go all out for somebody that meant the world to you. The closest friend you really have, the best guy, the most valuable subject in your kingdom. Haman, what would you do for him? Haman already knew. He said, well, if that were me, I'd probably get the best horse out of the king's royal stable, and I'd have it decked out with, the very best of the king's livery. And just like when you go out riding, and everybody sees there's the king, I'd have a parade for the king. But I would put that person, instead of the king, I'd put that person on the horse and have everybody in the kingdom say, see, this guy is a guy that the king really thinks is someone special. And the king said, well, thank you, Haman. Go get my horse and saddle him up and put the best livery on him, and you lead him through the kingdom and put Mordecai on the horse. And you want to talk about mortified. Haman was mortified over Mordecai being on the horse. You talk about a mess. It just couldn't have gone. Listen, when you promote yourself, when you're ready to take the place of preeminence and prominence, this is where you go. This is where you get to. You go from, listen, okay, you have the king. He's the most powerful man in the world. You're not going to be more powerful than him, right? But Haman kind of thought, well, I'm going to look like him at least. Honestly, anybody ought to know that. But then you have the person that the king wants to honor more than anyone else, Mordecai. Well, what would be the next best place? Leading the horse. Just seriously. It was an honor from the king's perspective to let him lead Mordecai's horse. It really was. That was number 3 spot. And the king had actually, the irony of it all is the king is absolutely innocent of all of this. He actually has honored Haman and could not have done so in a more cruel way. He could not have gotten Haman any worse. Haman's built the gallows for Mordecai. Mordecai knows it. Zeresh, his wife, knows it. Everybody else knows it. And now Haman's leading the guy he's going to hang through town on the king's horse. And this story has just gotten ridiculous. Why is that? Well, because, my friend, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. As the rivers of water, he moveth it whithersoever he will. And there is a force at play that the king has no idea of. There's a force at play that Haman hasn't a concept of. There's a force in play that Mordecai very well understands. And it's interesting that the Scripture's commentary, if you read it closely, Mordecai got on the horse, Haman led him through town, and then Mordecai got off the horse and went back to work. Mordecai didn't go home and say, guess what happened to me today? You say, well, Pastor, Mordecai had some gallows that were 75 cubits tall. Cubits, the span between the longest finger on the hand, if you have a long finger on your hand, otherwise you're a boxer. Between the longest finger on the hand and your elbow. And so for me, I think for me it's like 19 or 20 inches. For some, I don't remember exactly. I've measured my cubit before. We might have to measure that sometime when we do our measuring, which we haven't done in a while. Anyway, that's a pretty high gallows. If you're looking at Albertsons out here and you have Mordecai's gallows, it'd be like a crane over the top of the gallows. It's a big deal. And this is what Haman has in mind for Mordecai. So, Haman gets home, goes to the banquet, and we know what happens at the banquet, right? Okay, that's what we're going to look at for just a little bit. We'll be finished here in a few minutes. We're going to look at the art of the appeal. Okay, the art of the appeal. If Donald Trump's going to be in the news, he's going to be in the sermons. I just can't help it. So, I hope he doesn't sue me. Anyway, the art of the appeal. I want to look at this evening the appropriate way to appeal. First thing I want to see this evening, and by the way, this is intended to be practical. There's a right way to appeal matters. There's a right way to deal with circumstances and situations in life that are contrary to justice, common sense, and contrary as well to personal safety. Well, we could say that what Haman has done to Mordecai and to the Jews is unjust, could we not?
Yes.
We could say that what Haman has done to Mordecai and the Jews is unjust, could we not?
Yes.
Right.
It's contrary to common sense. And so it is also, we could say, a dangerous situation for the Jews. This is a big deal. This is not something that Mordecai can say, well, we'll just see what happens on. And so I want to look at the art of the appeal. The first thing that I see in our text this evening is that it's important for us to take matters seriously. It's important to take a serious matter seriously. Some Christians have the head in the sand approach to important matters. We're just going to trust God. Well, what you mean is you're not going to invest yourself in doing anything. Sometimes is what that means. You're not going to invest yourself in being proactive and having a voice that you could have. But the first thing we see in order to take matters seriously is what Mordecai did in chapter 4. When Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes. Doesn't mean he used somebody else's clothes and paid money for it. No, he tore his clothes and he put on sackcloth with ashes and went out into the midst of the city and cried with a loud and bitter cry, and came even before the king's gate. For none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. Okay, if Mordecai is a guy that hangs around the king's gates, around the palace, and knows what's going on around there, he's known in those places. And so Mordecai's coming to the king's gate, my friend, is not just, he was wandering about in distress and wound up at the palace, but he couldn't go in because he was in sackcloth and ashes. Why did Mordecai wind up at the palace? He put one foot in front of the other. Claymations are coming out now. He wound up at the palace because he wanted the people in the palace to know what was going on. Whereas if you're going to kill people who are a scourge, Mordecai wanted to put a face. They wanted to say, this is the face of the person you're going to kill. I'm the people that are the blight of the world. It's me. And going to the palace, who would have been the personage of importance there?
Esther.
Esther had her place.
Okay.
But she wasn't in that palace. She had her own palace. The king would have been. And who is it that was responsible for the decision based on council to wipe out all the Jews in the world?
The king?
The king actually is. There's a bit of boldness here. Mordecai's taking the matter seriously, but he's bold about it. He's not cowardly. He's not hiding, going around crying with his people and saying, we're all going to die. He's saying, we're going to die, and right here's where I'm going to do it. Right in front of the person that wantonly signed my death warrant. And so we see, as Mordecai begins the appeal, we see that the first thing that he does is he makes the matter known, and he takes the matter seriously. When you put on sackcloth and ashes, it's a serious event. It's a serious matter. Mordecai was not granted, he was not allowed admission to the palace because no person could come into that place in sackcloth and ashes. Okay? There are a lot more things that we could see, but I want to focus now on Esther for the rest of the few minutes that we have. In chapter 5 and verse 4, as we see the appeal, first of all, I guess we should say before this, stepping back just a step, one of the things that Esther does is that she takes chances, but she puts herself in a place, in the right place, to appeal. When Esther came into the inner court of the king's palace outside of the royal palace, she put herself in a place of vulnerability. Friend, a threat and an appeal are two different things entirely. A threat is this is what I'm going to do if I don't get what I want. An appeal is, this is what I want, and if I don't get it, I don't know what I'll do. And nobody is in a more vulnerable position regarding this than the woman who steps without permission into the king's court and stands meekly there waiting for either her death sentence or for the mercy of the king. Friend, you are not appealing when you ask with a demand. So many times we as believers, we misunderstand what it is to be a child of God. You know, it's great for a Christian to exercise their rights. But it's a different thing when a Christian demands rights. Have you ever considered that there are places and times and circumstances when believers don't have rights, and that is perfectly within God's will? Thank God we live in the country we do. And friend, we have rights in this nation. Oh, our rights can be trampled, but we can still say something about it, can't we? And we actually, when our rights are trampled, we actually have some recourse. But you know, I think that Christians would be perhaps more appealing to the world if we didn't stand up and demand, but if we stood out and appealed. And I believe there's a big difference. You know, I've found many times just in life that the way I ask something has a world to do with the way I'm treated with regard to whether I receive it. And I'll be honest with you, in most places I get exceptional service. This is just true. Most places I go, I get treated, I think, better than the average person. And I've realized that one of the things that helps me get treated better than the average person is just the way that I treat the people that I'm asking for help to. You know, I've many times called someone and asked for help, and they wouldn't normally have helped somebody, but they've helped me. I remember a couple of weeks ago, I was working on our car. We were test running it. We were on our way to get something fixed on it. We ended up in Melbourne breaking down. And that's not really nearby here, and it was very inconvenient. It was an inconvenient time we broke down. It was 11 o'clock at night. So Melissa and I, we made it through the night, did our thing, and got up in the morning, and I needed an injector for a Pumpadouce diesel engine. And I'll be honest with you, the parts stores don't sell those. Okay, so I needed one, so I called a guy that was a VW guy, and he said, "Sorry, man, can't help you." Well, the problem is that I didn't have anyone that could help me if he couldn't help me. And so I talked to him a little bit, and I appealed to him. Just said, here's the situation that I'm in, and my understanding is that if you can't help me, nobody can. And I put myself at his mercy in a sense. Now, obviously, he couldn't kill me. He couldn't take my Volkswagen from me or anything like that. But, you know what? The position I put him in made him desire to help me. And he said, call this guy. And he gave me a number. And I called that guy, and the guy said, well, I'm a shop. I work on cars. I don't sell parts. And I don't have one here, so I can't really help you. And so I just said, I'm kind of in a tough situation right now. I said, I really don't know anyone around here. And from what I understand, the guy I spoke to told me you're the only guy that could figure something like this out. And I said, what would you do? What would you do if you were in my situation? I'm trying to get some advice from somebody that knows. And he said, well, hold on a minute. Gets on his computer, starts typing numbers, and comes up with, he said, well, there's a place where I could get the part if I were to order it. And Advance Auto could actually order because they buy out this company. So if you go to Advance Auto and you give them this and this and this and this, and I mean, he gave me all kinds of things. Long story short, I got home. Both of those men I spoke with said, nope, can't help you when I called them on the phone. There was nothing in it for them. They weren't going to make any money off of me. I wasn't able to bring my car there and get it worked on, but they helped me out. Why'd they help me out? Well, because I appealed to them. I didn't say, well, listen, don't be a jerk about it. Just because you can't make a buck doesn't mean, you can't help someone else fix their car. No, it's how you ask things. Sometimes we as Christians are demanding, but we're not appealing. We're demanding, but we're not appealing. And friend, there's nothing wrong with being appealing, as Esther was here with the king. And so when she stood in the golden court, the king spied her. He said, oh, there's Esther. She was dressed nicely in her royal apparel, and she was standing there. She wasn't going, hey, buddy, you better listen to me if you want. You know, Vashti had already found out about how to treat the king that way. And he saw her, and he stretched out his, he said, Esther, you come in here. And he told her, he said, I'll tell you what, whatever you've come for, if you come to appeal for something, I'll give you anything up to the half of my kingdom. And she said, I'd like to tell you, but I need time with you. I need to talk to you about it. Can you come to a banquet, you and Haman? So he came to the banquet. He said, Esther, whatever it is that you've asked, I know it's important because of the time that you've taken, but just let me know what it is. I'll do it for you. I mean, I'll give you half of my kingdom, Esther. That was a lot of kingdom. So, Esther, you want something big? I'll give you anything. And she said, well, you get old Haman. She didn't say old Haman. But she said, you get Haman, and you guys come back, and I'll tell you tonight. The art of the appeal. One of the things that we see here is that not only did Mordecai and Esther take the situation seriously, but they began the appeal by asking for something reasonable. Something reasonable. You're not very likely to get somebody to go to the moon and back for you, but you might be able to get them to do something that's reasonable. What would you like me to do? Well, I'd like you to move heaven and earth and go to the moon. Well, probably not. But it's pretty reasonable to say, if you wouldn't mind, if you could come, if you could do this for me. You know something, friend? You and I need to recognize as well when we appeal that there needs to be a willingness in us to do something in return for what we're asking. We don't need divas in society. And I'm talking men and ladies. I see them nowadays. People that really literally think that life's all about them and they're just waiting for their entourage when they go somewhere. They just can't believe it that people don't recognize that they're the most important, that they need the first place, and they need the best of everything, and everyone else needs to defer to them. Sometimes we can behave that way. Sometimes we can act like, well, I'm so-and-so. Well, you know something? Esther was the queen. Out of all the girls, all the young ladies in the kingdom, in the entire world, Esther is the one that was chosen to be the queen. And Esther's attitude was, let me do something for you. And, I've heard people say, well, she was buttering up the king. I don't think so. I think that she wanted to be in the right environment, in the right place. And that's the next thing I want to see. I want us to understand tonight. There is a right time and there's a right place. If she had been in the royal palace and Haman was somewhere else, it would have been a very detached kind of a situation. She'd already risked things to be there. And so she didn't have a legal right to come before the king. And so what Esther said is, let me get some legal standing here before I ask you. Because she is really there at his mercy, but when the king comes into her place, he's her guest. And he is now in her place of hospitality. And so when we're going to appeal, friend, one of the things we need to learn to do is do something for someone. In other words, would you ask someone to do something for you that you wouldn't be willing to do for them? That's not reasonable, is it? Yeah, we live in a society, and I'm speaking kind of a Christian worldview more than anything. I don't know what the world does. But a lot of Christians kind of have an entitlement mindset, worldview. Like, I deserve this. I have the right to this. And you know something? It's much better, it's far better to get to a place where maybe you do have some rights, but then you treat the person with deference in that place. In other words, Esther had the opportunity, when the king came to the banquet that she prepared for him, she had the opportunity to return to him the deference and the respect that he had given to her. And then we see that the queen was careful to treat all people equally. Keep in mind, Haman's a bigot. He hates every Jew in the world just because he hates Mordecai. And he hates Mordecai just because he loves himself. He's a bigoted, arrogant, pompous, And you could just keep going on and on describing Haman. And yet, the queen is not being cruel to Haman in her deference to him. He is still probably the second most powerful man in the world, and he's influential enough to get the king to sign a decree to kill everyone. And so the queen, as well as treating the king with deference, treats Haman with deference. And who's Haman? He's a bigot. You all agree with me? Let's say it. Haman is a bigot. And the queen treats him how? With deference. You know, sometimes Christians, we can be kind of nasty when we don't like somebody. We can be kind of nasty when someone doesn't like us. And you know something? That isn't the right way to appeal. The right way to appeal is to be different than the people even to whom we are appealing. Don't think that Esther is appealing only to the king. Esther is appealing to the king and his right-hand henchman, Haman, who's a bigot. I tell you, Haman was a bigot. He's a bigot. Okay, so now, the irony of his bigotry, of course, doesn't escape us. But also keep in mind that as far as Esther is concerned, she's about to reveal her identity to a bigot. Right? This is an important matter. See, Esther is still not like, I'm going to tell the king what you did, buddy. Boy, you're going to be in big trouble. No, Esther realizes that Haman's the guy that was one of the men who spoke to the king about Vashti and got her canned from being queen. He's a powerful man, and he's a bigot, and her appeal is the same to him as it is to the king. By the way, the king's a bigot too. Yeah, the king is willing to wipe out an entire race of people just because they possibly could be a threat to him. No substantiation. No, they've done this, and they're a scourge. He's willing just to wipe them out. The king's a bigot. Isn't he? When Vashti disrespected him in front of the whole world, he just had her just basically erased. He's a bigot. And so Esther is dealing with these men with whom she's not the equal of either. She's not, I'm the king's queen and so I'm higher than Haman. No, she just has the same appeal that he does. Okay, let's finish up. Okay, so we're going to make an appeal. Understand that we need to treat all people equally, even if they're bigots. Okay, that's fun to say, isn't it? Now, we take the situation seriously, and the last thing I want to look at is you want to ask for something reasonable. Go to chapter 7. So the king and Haman came to banquet with Esther the queen. And the king said again unto Esther on the second day at the banquet of wine, What's thy petition, Queen Esther, and it shall be granted thee? And what is thy request, and it shall be performed? Again, what did he say? Even to the half of my kingdom. Then Esther the queen answered and said, If I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given at my petition, and my people at my request. She said, Well, we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. But if we'd been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. Esther said, if I had just been sold to be a slave, I wouldn't have much to say. She's making a reasonable request. She said, the thing is, king, the thing that you've signed is that basically I'm to be sold, but I'm sold to be killed instead of just sold to be a slave. Was her request reasonable?
Yes.
Now, in the end, what happened is this. Haman was hung on the gallows that he made for Mordecai. Haman's household and the supervision of the people of his household was turned over to Mordecai. Haman's ring, which signified his authority, was given to Mordecai, and Mordecai was put in the position of the greatest trust, which had once belonged to Haman, but Mordecai had the position in an even stronger, more influential way. That's the outcome. Is that what Esther asked for?
No.
What did Esther ask for? She asked for the very least that she could. And friend, when you and I make an appeal, sometimes, as I said in the beginning, sometimes we're a little bit demanding. Do you recognize that if you're going to make an appeal after the model of Esther and you understand the art of the appeal, oftentimes you'll get more than you asked for in a good way? Esther got more than she asked for in a good way. But what she asked for was reasonable. Nothing makes an unreasonable, even bigoted person more reasonable than asking them the least of what is reasonable. And that's all Esther asked for. She said, you know something? If we could just not be killed, that's all I'd like. I don't mind being a slave or sold into bondage or whatever, but if my people and I could just not be killed. And the king, it hadn't all clicked yet. He said, who in the world is it that has sold you? Who's done this to you? Who is he? Where is he that durst presume in his heart to do so? And Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. And Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. And friend, tonight we have seen the art of the appeal. Father, thank you so much for what we've learned. I pray that you would help some of these truths to sink in a practical, usable way for us so that we could be salt and light. We thank you for it in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, the only thing left to do now is to celebrate Michael's birthday. Michael